What happens when a proud European suddenly discovers that the country his ancestors once rejected feels more alive, more generous, and more exciting than the homeland he was taught to love? Keep watching, hit like, and follow now, because the next American culture shock may rewrite everything you thought you knew. Imagine a perfectly ordinary Englishman holding a pen, staring at the American Declaration of Independence, and suddenly realizing that his ancestors from 250 years ago would probably have no idea what to say about him. It sounds like a joke. It sounds like historical comedy. But according to the experiences shared by travelers and Europeans living in America, something remarkably similar is happening in real life. Europeans who once inherited centuries of pride are increasingly fascinated by the United States, a country their ancestors once treated as a rebellious experiment across the Atlantic. The descendants of people who spent generations trying to separate themselves from American influence are now describing America as a kind of emotional medicine. Some talk as if returning to Europe gives them post-American depression. Others describe an almost ridiculous American addiction syndrome, where ordinary things like huge roads, enormous meals, friendly strangers, and giant stores suddenly feel impossible to live without. And the contrast becomes even more dramatic when travelers compare the bright, spacious American experience with what they describe as the grayness, inconvenience, and emotional coldness they associate with parts of Europe. So has Europe's ancient heritage really begun losing a psychological battle against American comfort? Why are people from countries with thousands of years of history suddenly dreaming about Costco, Texas BBQ, giant supermarkets, and smiling strangers? What exactly happens to a European mind after America gets under its skin? For some visitors, the transformation begins almost immediately. The old continent suddenly feels tiny. The streets seem narrow, the stores feel limited, and the familiar routines that once seemed sophisticated begin looking strangely restrictive. Imagine spending your whole life believing your 1,000-year-old homeland represents the finished product of civilization, only to arrive in America and feel as if someone has opened an unfinished door into a much larger world. For these travelers, America does not feel like a completely foreign country. It feels like Britain, France, or Germany after someone injected 5 million doses of steroids directly into its bloodstream. Everything is amplified. Everything is oversized. Everything is turned up. One traveler described it with almost childlike disbelief. "Can someone give me a good enough reason not to move to this country?" America, he said, was basically the UK on steroids times 5 million. The food was 10 times bigger. The drinks were 10 times bigger. Everything was 10 times bigger. Everything was nicer. Even the sunshine seemed better. The weather felt better. And then came the question he simply could not escape. What exactly does the UK still have for me? He admitted that Britain has a few things, obviously, but compared with what he was seeing, he felt as if America was operating on an entirely different scale. What a place. What a place. And then came the first visual shock. It wasn't necessarily the skyscrapers. It wasn't even the famous landmarks. It was the roads. The roads were so wide and expansive that some visitors said they felt like they had stepped directly into GTA 6. Instead of driving through what felt like ordinary streets, they suddenly felt like extras inside a multi-million-dollar action movie. One traveler practically exploded with excitement, asking why the roads were so enormous. Another kept repeating that he genuinely felt like he was inside GTA 6 and joked that someone should put him in the game because he was actually living it. He couldn't stop staring. He wanted to get out of the car just to experience the scene properly. He joked about overstaying his welcome, wondered whether he would be sent back to Britain or Africa if he stayed too long, and laughed about eventually being deported. The conversation became chaotic, but underneath all the jokes was something incredibly simple. The environment looked so different that his brain couldn't process it as normal life. He said he felt like he was inside San Andreas, like some kind of misfit wandering around a world that had previously existed only on a screen. For him, America didn't look real. It looked like a video game that had suddenly become physical. And that feeling continues everywhere. The giant food portions, the enormous glasses of water, the trucks that make European cars look like children's toys, the sheer amount of space. The American obsession with scale seems to follow visitors around like a shadow. A medium drink can look like a large drink somewhere else. A road can look like a highway. A pickup truck can look like a small apartment with wheels. People call this overwhelming, but for some Europeans, the overwhelming part eventually becomes the attraction. They begin experiencing what could jokingly be called American scale syndrome, where normal European proportions suddenly feel strangely disappointing. Have you ever stood in front of a Starbucks or Shake Shack counter and experienced complete choice overload because there were simply too many options? In Europe, sophistication is often associated with restraint, precision, and knowing exactly what you need. In America, the experience can feel like being thrown into a giant menu where the answer is always, "You can have more." And after enough time, that abundance starts changing your expectations. One traveler described the shock of returning to the United Kingdom after an enjoyable trip abroad. He had been lucky enough to spend time away, but the hardest part was not leaving the wonderful destination. It was coming back. The moment he landed at Stansted, he said he immediately knew he was back in Britain. The airport felt like disorganized chaos. Tape was everywhere, creating a bizarre slalom through the terminal. The stairs hadn't arrived properly. Nothing seemed to work. Both escalators were out, meaning elderly passengers had to struggle upstairs or dragging their luggage. His reaction was essentially, "Well, I'm really back in the UK, where nothing works." Then another plane emptied at almost the same time, and suddenly everyone was squeezed into a narrow corridor, moving together toward passport control. Instead of the smooth, cinematic arrival travelers imagine, he described a cramped procession where everyone seemed trapped inside the same bottleneck. And then things became even stranger. He encountered a man who had just stepped off the plane so drunk that he could barely walk. The man was stumbling, swearing, shouting at people, and generally creating chaos. The traveler couldn't believe it. He looked around and basically thought, only in the UK could this happen. Then the drunk man somehow ended up near a group of schoolchildren returning from a trip and began shouting swear words around them. Eventually, someone escorted him away. But the strangest part was what happened next. Everyone else was patiently waiting in line at passport control, while the drunk passenger was escorted around the queue and somehow reached passport control before the ordinary passengers. The traveler joked that because the man was drunk and disorderly, he would probably be escorted outside and perhaps even given a taxi paid for by someone else to take him back wherever he had come from. To the traveler, this wasn't just an isolated incident. It became another symbol of the frustration he associated with returning home. Then came the deeper complaint, the feeling of being trapped. He argued that since Brexit, Britons can only spend limited periods in European countries without the same freedom to simply move there as before. To him, that restriction felt like imprisonment. He said he desperately wanted out and believed many others felt the same way. The sensation wasn't simply inconvenience. It was the psychological feeling of being controlled, stuck, and unable to escape a place that had once felt wonderful. He remembered loving Britain when he was younger. London had once seemed magical. It had been an exciting place to grow up. But now he wondered who would even want to go there. He described seeing a program about a young woman sitting with her bag between her feet while eating lunch, when someone simply slid the bag out from underneath her legs and disappeared. the story triggered a much darker fear. Worries about being robbed, attacked, stabbed, drugged, assaulted, or having something terrible happen to a loved one. He even described fears involving his child being attacked or abducted. His conclusion was blunt: "I just want out." And then came the emotional whiplash. Returning home after being somewhere else made everything feel dramatically worse. He said people in other places seemed more polite, more caring, and more protective of their environment. They appeared to take better care of where they lived. By comparison, he felt surrounded by people who simply didn't care. He described the atmosphere as miserable and said that coming back magnified the negative feelings by something like 100,000 times. Every flaw that might normally disappear into everyday routine suddenly became impossible to ignore. This is where the American comparison becomes almost cinematic. For some European visitors, America feels like a giant Hollywood set that someone forgot to take down. The famous yellow school buses they had seen countless times in movies actually exist. The enormous lawyer advertisements beside highways are real. The roads look like television. The fire hydrants that once seemed like background props are actually sitting on real streets. Suddenly, the entire American visual vocabulary they absorbed from childhood movies becomes physical. One traveler from outside America explained the feeling perfectly in his own casual way. Americans might not understand why these things are exciting because they see them every day. But someone arriving from Ireland or another country can walk down an American street and feel like they're inside a childhood fantasy. The school bus isn't a movie prop, it's actually there. The street looks like the most American street imaginable. Every movie, every television show, every influencer, every YouTuber seems to have been doing things in America. And now the visitor is finally standing inside that world himself. He couldn't understand why a fire hydrant was even there, because he had assumed it was simply something filmmakers used to make backgrounds look American. Then he realized it was real. He started comparing America with Ireland and concluded that there seemed to be dramatically more things to do. Back home, he said, friends might sit around asking what they should do because there was nothing interesting happening. In America, there were parks, restaurants, activities, entertainment, and places like Topgolf. The possibilities seemed endless. To him, the contrast was depressing because it forced him to reconsider what he had previously accepted as normal. Of course, someone living in America might watch this and wonder what on earth these visitors are talking about. But for someone arriving from outside the country, the experience can feel like walking into a dream. Imagine watching American movies as a child, and then suddenly finding yourself standing in the middle of the exact visual world you saw on television. It's almost absurd. It's almost funny. It's also strangely powerful. Another visitor described America as literally being a movie. He imagined a man driving around in a truck so enormous that it looked larger than his apartment, an American flag flying from it while he cruised along at 4 miles per hour for seemingly no reason. Then there was a woman power walking in an entirely pink outfit while carrying what looked like a gallon of water, as though she were training for the Olympics. Then came the squirrel. The squirrel simply stared directly at him. He couldn't understand what the squirrel's plan was. Why was it making eye contact? Why was this tiny animal behaving like a supporting character in an American film? And then, according to his description, there was always some completely unpredictable person walking around doing something bizarre. That was America to him, a place where even the background characters seemed scripted. From the glowing advertisements of Times Square to the enormous natural landscapes of Yellowstone, America can make a vacation feel too short. One traveler described Yellowstone as genuinely stunning. When his family moved to the United States, Yellowstone had been one of the first places they wrote down on their list of destinations. 4 years later, they finally made it there, and he said the experience was living up to expectations. Then there was New York, the concrete jungle where dreams are supposedly made. Simply walking through the streets created excitement. One visitor said a woman who was clearly in a hurry still stopped long enough to compliment her and tell her she was beautiful. For someone accustomed to a different social atmosphere, even that tiny interaction felt remarkable. The taxi, the lights, the energy, the sheer number of things happening at once, it all created the feeling that something exciting could happen at any moment. She admitted that some parts of the city smelled terrible, but even that became part of the adventure. She put on a face mask and continued walking towards 7-Eleven, fascinated by the huge signs and bright commercial landscape. Times Square, with its giant billboards and flashing lights, felt like an experience everyone should have at least once. Then came dinner at Raising Cane's, followed by plans to try even more American food. Day one in New York was already enough to create a completely different expectation of what a city could feel like. And then there's Dallas. Even the sticky heat can become part of the attraction. Electric scooters everywhere, hot air rushing through the doorway in the morning, a strange sense of freedom. Once some travelers become accustomed to this environment, they say the orderly, cozy European lifestyle starts feeling less like comfort and more like stagnation. The old continent can suddenly feel like a beautifully preserved room where nothing is allowed to move. So ask yourself, would you choose an American burger large enough to feed a London family for 2 days, or remain loyal to the delicate portions of your homeland? If you had to choose between living inside a 1,000-year-old museum and walking through a glowing Hollywood film set, which one would you choose? And if you think a proud Englishman or Frenchman could never surrender his cultural self-respect, wait until the ultimate contradiction arrives. Imagine that same European holding a pen, signing the American Declaration of Independence, and then realizing that he has just committed the kind of historical betrayal his ancestors would have considered unbelievable. He isn't being forced. Nobody is threatening him. He is doing it voluntarily, smiling while he does it. Then the guilt arrives. How exactly do I explain this to my ancestors 250 years ago? One British traveler described returning to America after landing in Los Angeles with almost uncontrollable excitement. He had barely recovered from the flight. His eyes were tired, but the moment he realized he was back in the United States, the exhaustion seemed irrelevant. He joked about needing food, celebrating surviving the flight and border control, and simply being back. "We're back," became the emotional summary. They were back. Back in America. And perhaps that's the strangest part of all. For some Europeans, America stops feeling like a destination and starts feeling like an escape. The trip becomes less about sightseeing and more about discovering a version of themselves they didn't know existed. Imagine the historical irony. A pure Englishman standing on July 4th, taking a pen and voluntarily signing the Declaration of Independence. No army is forcing him. No government is ordering him. He does it with a smile. And then, somewhere deep inside, a voice whispers, "What would my ancestors think?" One British visitor described his July 4th experience as the most American day he had ever experienced. He still wasn't entirely convinced it had actually happened. He woke up with coffee, and within roughly 30 seconds, a stranger had somehow replaced it with a Bud Light. He couldn't decide whether that was hospitality or an initiation ceremony. In Britain, he joked, a neighbor might ask to borrow your lawnmower. In America, apparently, someone looks at you and thinks, that man needs a beer before breakfast. Then they went to a fair where he joked that he wasn't sure the king would approve. As a Brit, he imagined that British HR might not be especially pleased with the situation. Then came the moment that created the ultimate historical contradiction. He signed the Declaration of Independence. 250 years later, another Brit had crossed the Atlantic and voluntarily signed the document that represented America's break from Britain. He could practically imagine his ancestors staring at him in disbelief. The night ended with another first, setting off their own fireworks. They had never done it before. They lit the fuse and immediately ran away, because every American movie they had ever seen showed Americans lighting fireworks and sprinting away from the explosion. He had assumed that was simply the official procedure. Apparently, Americans weren't necessarily panicking. Brits, however, hear one hiss and suddenly become Olympic sprinters. But what really stayed with him was the friendliness. Everywhere they went, people said, "Happy 4th." He had never experienced that kind of collective atmosphere before. Everyone seemed to be smiling. Everyone seemed to want to enjoy the day. Back home, he joked, if someone smiled at him, his first instinct would be to check whether his wallet was still there. He said he would genuinely never forget experiencing the 250th 4th of July. America was absolutely mental, but he meant it as the highest possible compliment. The confused British visitor had been allowed to participate in something he never expected to experience, and he was grateful. This is where the so-called European betrayal becomes more than a joke. The descendants of empires that once dominated the world are now admitting a deeply uncomfortable truth. They can become fascinated with the very nation their ancestors once considered a rebellious colony. The attraction isn't simply about monuments or vacations. It can become about freedom, comfort, scale, entertainment, and the feeling that life is supposed to be experienced rather than merely endured. Some Europeans now describe their own countries with extreme language, calling them stagnant, restrictive, or even liberal communist societies. Those are personal opinions, not universal facts, but the emotional message behind them is unmistakable. They feel constrained. They want something different. They want space. They want freedom. They want abundance. And, apparently, they want ranch dressing. One traveler described himself as a fully documented legal immigrant from Germany, preparing to fly back to what he called the greatest country in the world, America. He joked about his name making people assume he was Latino, explained that he was simply tanned from spending too much time in Europe, and celebrated leaving what he called liberal communist Europe behind. He wanted to return to America for liberty, freedom, and ranch. He even jokingly apologized to the American president for previous jokes he had made, claiming he had been misinformed at the time. His love for American culture had apparently become so intense that he praised American sports while humorously confusing Tom Brady with the Knicks. The entire clip was deliberately ridiculous, but beneath the comedy was the same recurring theme. America had become something he emotionally identified with. And then France enters the story. For a nation famous for its pride, food, language, and cultural identity, imagine a French traveler standing in America and declaring that perhaps the phrase should no longer be "Vive la France." Perhaps it should be "Vive l'Amérique." That is not merely tourism, that is cultural rebellion. The French traveler described America as incredible. C'est incroyable. Then he tried Texas BBQ for the first time. His reaction was almost religious. He claimed it was better than any moment in his life, despite being married and having 2 children. He compared the brisket with French classics like crepes, pain au chocolat, and croissants, and joked that he would trade his left arm's worth of loyalty for Texas brisket. The old world doesn't necessarily disappear, but after America, it can look different. And perhaps that is the real danger of the American addiction syndrome. Once you become accustomed to the space, the scale, the friendliness, the constant options, and the cinematic energy, can you really return to the smaller version of life without noticing the difference? And once that comparison begins, the cultural shock becomes impossible to ignore. Europeans who once laughed at American excess can suddenly find themselves fascinated by American flags, giant celebrations, and the sheer enthusiasm surrounding July 4th. A holiday that was once associated with a rebellious former colony becomes an emotional spectacle powerful enough to make visitors forget their own national identity for a moment. Some even returned home, jokingly apologizing to an American president they had previously mocked, admitting that they had been misinformed for years. Imagine your ancestors watching you celebrate the country they once fought to separate themselves from. Would they disinherit you? Would they simply stare in silence? Or would they secretly ask for some ranch dressing too? And that is where this strange cultural betrayal goes much deeper than food, flags, or giant stores. It begins changing how Europeans perceive other people. Suddenly, the warmth of strangers in America can make the old continent feel emotionally colder than they ever noticed before. Buckle up, because this may be the most uncomfortable part of the entire transformation. Have we forgotten what genuine everyday kindness feels like until an American stranger suddenly smiles at us? Think about London or Paris. If a complete stranger walks toward you on the street and smiles for absolutely no obvious reason, what is your first reaction? Do you smile back? Or do you immediately check your wallet and wonder what this suspicious person wants? In the version of Europe described by these travelers, people move through cities with exhausted faces, rushing from one obligation to another, as if the entire world is about to collapse. In America, meanwhile, a simple smile can completely change the atmosphere of your day. Americans don't merely laugh. They turn friendliness into part of the daily experience. One woman described what happened when she returned home after living in America for 2 years. She had only planned a short 4-day trip to see her family, but the emotional experience was much harder than she expected. When the plane landed and she began driving through the familiar streets where she had grown up, something felt deeply wrong. She recognized everything, but she didn't feel at home. It felt familiar, but not like home anymore. That realization caught her completely off guard. Then, the little things began exposing the difference. She would walk into coffee shops and automatically use what she called her Americanisms. She would smile and say, "Hi, how are you?" expecting some kind of friendly response. Instead, the interaction would immediately become transactional. She would say hello, and the employee would simply ask what she wanted. She would place her order, and the conversation would continue in the most practical way possible. Then she discovered something that seemed almost unbelievable after America. The coffee shop didn't have almond milk. Her reaction was basically, "America would never do that to me." When she left, she casually said, "Have a good one," and the woman serving her looked at her as if she had completely lost her mind. She wasn't even sure the woman had properly said hello when she first entered. That was the moment she realized how much she missed American hospitality. It wasn't some huge, dramatic event. It was tiny interactions. It was being greeted. It was being asked how she was. It was having someone actually engage with her. It was the expectation that customer service would feel like service rather than simply completing a transaction. Restaurants created the same shock. She noticed that back home, they weren't automatically offered water when they sat down. Sometimes they waited more than 15 minutes before someone even came over to take their drink order. These things might sound ridiculous when explained individually, but after becoming accustomed to American service, they suddenly felt enormous. She admitted that perhaps tips play a role, but she genuinely appreciated the extra attention. At the same time, she didn't want to claim that everyone back home was miserable or unfriendly. Some people were genuinely kind, and she was surprised by how friendly certain interactions could be. But she still walked away with an uncomfortable realization. She no longer felt completely like a local in either place. In America, people constantly complimented her accent, reminding her that she wasn't originally from there. Back home, she had begun behaving differently because of what she had learned in America. And yet, Something beautiful happened during the return trip too. Walking through places she had known her entire life, she started noticing things she had previously ignored. She looked at the houses and the neighborhoods and suddenly thought they were beautiful. The architecture reminded her of an English storybook. Returning home gave her a new appreciation for the place she came from, even while confirming that she was happier living in America. The conclusion became surprisingly clear. She didn't want to move back. She wasn't missing the land or the environment. She missed people. But she felt that she fit better in America. Her husband especially had become so Americanized that friends back home would joke about how American he seemed. And when he reunited with people he had known for years, where did he choose to go afterward? An American smokehouse barbecue restaurant for brisket. Sometimes the menu tells you everything you need to know. She was simply happy to be back in America. But the friendliness doesn't stop at smiles. Culture shock can begin right at the cashier's counter with 4 ordinary words. How are you today? For some Europeans, those words can sound suspicious at first. Is this a medical question? Is someone actually interested? Or is this just part of customer service? A German traveler described being genuinely surprised when a store employee proactively offered him free bottled water simply because the weather outside was extremely hot. In his hometown, that kind of spontaneous gesture felt almost like science fiction. But in America, particularly in places known for Southern hospitality, these tiny acts can make visitors feel noticed instead of invisible. And this brings us to one of the biggest arguments surrounding American friendliness. Is it real or is it fake? One German commentator addressed this directly after receiving many responses to an earlier discussion about Americans being friendlier than Germans. Some Germans had objected, arguing that Germans were simply more direct and that Americans were merely fake friendly. But when you examine the examples, the accusation becomes more complicated. Take bumping into someone in a store. In America, someone might accidentally brush against you and immediately say, "I'm sorry," or "Excuse me." In Germany, according to the personal experience described, people may simply continue walking. Of course, there are Germans who apologize, but the argument was that it happens less frequently. So when Americans apologize after accidentally bumping into someone, is that fake? Or is it simply basic courtesy? The commentator's answer was straightforward. It's manners. If someone brushes past you, bumps into you, or happens to stand in front of something you're trying to reach, saying "excuse me" instead of pushing them aside makes the interaction more pleasant. It happens on public transportation. It happens in supermarkets. And apparently, it happens constantly in Texas. In Texas, people might apologize even when they haven't actually touched you. If the aisle is narrow and someone walks past slightly too close, they may still say, "Excuse me." Nothing happened. Nobody was injured. Nobody was offended. Yet the apology arrives anyway. So what exactly are you supposed to call that? Fake friendliness? Or simply politeness? And then there is the customer service argument. Critics say American employees are only friendly because they want something in return. But the response is almost brutally simple. Isn't that literally what customer service is supposed to be? Of course, a cashier doesn't necessarily care about you deep within their soul. They aren't your lifelong friend. But their job is to make the experience pleasant. If you walk into a store and someone says, "Hey, how are you doing? Can I help you find something? Here are today's offers." Isn't that simply better service? Compare that with walking into a German store and feeling as if the employee is trying to disappear before you can ask a question. The German commentator acknowledged that Germans often prefer shopping in peace and don't want to feel harassed by employees. But she didn't personally see a problem with someone approaching her and saying, "Hey, can I help you with something? Just let me know. To her, that wasn't harassment. It was customer service. Then comes the second accusation. Americans compliment strangers. Someone might walk up and say, "I like your jeans," or, "Oh my God, I love your shirt." Critics can interpret that as fake. But what exactly does the stranger gain from doing it? They're not trying to sell you something. They may never see you again. They're simply saying something nice. Maybe they want to brighten your day. Maybe they like your outfit. Maybe they just feel like being friendly. There doesn't have to be some secret transaction hiding behind every compliment. And then comes the third criticism. Americans can be friendly to your face and talk badly about you behind your back. The response to that is much more balanced. That behavior can happen among acquaintances and friends, but why would a complete stranger on the street be talking badly about you when they don't even know who you are? And more importantly, is this really an American trait? The answer given was no. People like that exist everywhere. Germany has them, America has them, France has them, Canada has them. Every society contains people who behave one way publicly and another way privately. It depends on the individual. The commentator emphasized that she personally didn't believe Americans were generally more fake. She also questioned whether tourists who visit America briefly can really judge what Americans are like in deep friendships and personal relationships. Spending a few days on vacation isn't the same as living somewhere long enough to develop genuine friendships. So the entire fake-friendly argument becomes much less convincing when you separate customer service, casual kindness, and genuine personal relationships. If someone is friendly because it's their job, that's customer service. If a stranger compliments your shirt for no reason, that's simply a friendly interaction. And if someone eventually turns out to be fake in a friendship, that's human behavior, not something that belongs exclusively to one nationality. Still, the debate remains. What exactly do people mean when they say fake friendly? Is friendliness automatically fake just because it isn't backed by deep emotional attachment? If someone makes your day slightly better without asking for anything in return, why should that kindness be treated as suspicious? Maybe Americans aren't fake. Maybe Europeans have simply forgotten how strange, genuine, casual friendliness can feel when you aren't used to it. And then comes one of the strongest personal stories in the entire comparison. An English woman who moved to Dallas described the people as one of the biggest differences between Texas and the United Kingdom. She had lived around London for most of her life, but said London felt like a dead city when it came to making new friends. Outside her existing school and childhood friend group, she struggled to build new relationships. Then she moved to Texas. Within 8 months, she had experienced more spontaneous friendliness than she remembered experiencing throughout her entire life in London. People would simply approach her and start conversations. She believed Southern hospitality played a major role. She could attend a Pilates class, finish the session, and suddenly have another woman walk over and ask whether she wanted to get coffee afterward. "What's your name? Do you want to grab a coffee?" For her, that was shocking. She couldn't understand how welcoming everyone seemed. Even at grocery store checkouts, she noticed the employees were unusually conversational. She mentioned places like Trader Joe's, where checkout workers would talk to customers, ask questions, smile, and keep the interaction going instead of simply scanning the items and moving on. She described the friendliness as being on another level. And the numbers, at least in her personal experience, made the comparison even more dramatic. After only 8 months in Texas, she believed she had made more friends than she had made in London during her entire life. She called the difference insane. But for her, that friendliness had become one of the biggest reasons she loved living there. Americans might apologize even when they haven't touched you. Strangers might talk to you. Someone might compliment your clothes. A cashier might ask about your day. A couple in Texas might even give a tourist daughter $100 after meeting them for dinner. For a European visitor, these gestures can feel almost excessive, but that excess becomes part of the attraction. Some travelers describe becoming so social that returning home feels unbearable. The quiet pubs, the invisible neighbors, the people who rarely make eye contact, the feeling that everyone is protecting their own private bubble. After experiencing a culture where strangers casually talk to you, that silence can become unsettling. So which would you choose? A neighbor who never looks at you for 20 years, or a stranger who offers to buy you a beer before you even finish introducing yourself? Would you rather have the sophisticated isolation of a quiet old neighborhood, or the chaotic friendliness that everyone back home considers slightly strange? But remember, friendliness isn't the only American obsession waiting to destroy your ability to appreciate European convenience. Because once you discover Costco and Walmart, there may be no turning back. European ancestors spent centuries constructing enormous marble cathedrals. Modern descendants may now find themselves worshipping at entirely different temples, Costco and Walmart. For a European, walking into Costco isn't merely shopping, it's entering adult Disney World. The sheer scale can feel almost religious. Here, size isn't just a measurement. Scale becomes a belief system. You enter thinking you need toothpaste. You leave with an air mattress, a giant bag of scented candles, garden furniture, enough food for a small expedition, and perhaps an entirely new lifestyle you never intended to purchase. You can buy food, you can buy tents, you can buy surfboards, you can buy enough supplies to make it feel as though you're preparing for the collapse of civilization. In Europe, stores are often designed around efficiency. You find what you need and leave. In America, the experience can feel designed around getting lost in abundance. The store doesn't merely give you options, it overwhelms you with them, and the real tragedy arrives when you return home. You walk into a narrow European supermarket, look down the aisle, and suddenly wonder, where did everything go? Where is the rest of the row? Where is the giant selection? Where is the American-sized version of everything? That is when post-American depression begins. And then there is the drive-through culture. Once you experience sitting comfortably in your car while collecting burgers, coffee, medicine, and other necessities without getting out, the simple act of parking and walking can suddenly feel like an attack on your fundamental rights. Why should you have to leave the car? Why should you walk 20 meters? Why should you carry your groceries through a parking lot like some kind of medieval peasant, when the entire point of modern technology is convenience? After enough time in America, you may begin fantasizing about driving directly into your living room so you can unload everything without even opening the front door. That is when you know the transformation is complete. But America has even more conveniences waiting to create permanent psychological damage. Home banking is one example. Imagine sitting on your sofa and depositing a check directly through your phone. To someone accustomed to more traditional European banking systems, it can feel like magic. You aren't standing in a branch, you aren't filling out endless paperwork. You are simply sitting at home and handling the transaction from your phone. Then there is shaved ice. Some British visitors returned home and discovered that they had developed an inexplicable craving for the tiny frozen pieces they had experienced in America. Something that once looked insignificant had apparently become a life-changing obsession. The brain had been rewired. And then, perhaps most dangerously of all, there are free refills. In Europe, every drop of soda can feel precious. Each ounce is calculated. Every refill feels like another financial decision. In America, you order a medium and sometimes receive something that looks like a bucket. Then you discover the terrifying phrase, free refill. Drink it again, and again, and again. Keep going until your taste buds surrender. For tourists, free refills aren't merely about soda. They become symbols of a larger American idea, abundance without apology. Even the service reinforces it. Staff members can be so warm and attentive that leaving a tip starts feeling emotionally natural because the experience makes you feel important. So now the final choice becomes almost impossible. Would you rather shop in a 1,000-year-old European supermarket where every aisle is narrow and every shelf is carefully controlled? Or wander through Walmart for an entire day while buying enough food to fill a truck? Is your wallet trembling yet? Would you trade the elegance and history of the old continent for a glass of soda that never seems to run dry? And what happens when you finally have to leave? That's when the real psychological punishment begins. Post-American depression. The journey from Europe to America can ultimately leave travelers with an uncomfortable conclusion. The homeland that once seemed enormous because of its history can suddenly appear small, gloomy, and stagnant. A British visitor willingly signing the Declaration of Independence becomes more than a funny historical image. It becomes a symbol of national pride being challenged by America's anything is possible energy. The obsession with Costco, the fascination with giant stores, the craving for Texas BBQ, and the longing for strangers who casually say hello all point toward the same emotional transformation. Modern Europeans aren't always traveling to America simply to see America. Some are traveling to discover a different version of themselves, a version that feels freer, a version that feels more social, a version that feels less restricted, a version that wants to build instead of merely endure. And perhaps that is why the American experience can be so difficult to forget. Once someone becomes accustomed to the enormous scale, the convenience, the hospitality, and the feeling that almost anything might be possible, returning to the old routine can create a strange psychological gap. You may no longer feel completely local anywhere. You can miss your homeland while refusing to move back. You can admire European history while preferring American life. You can love your ancestors while quietly betraying everything they thought they were protecting. And maybe that's the ultimate contradiction. Would you choose a stable life inside what feels like a European heritage prison, or risk betraying centuries of tradition for freedom, giant supermarkets, and free soda? Is Europe slowly becoming a beautiful old museum whose residents can only watch the new world from behind the glass? And if the cost of living, bureaucracy, taxes, and everyday frustrations continue making people unhappy, how long before even the proudest European starts asking the forbidden question, what if America really is better for me? If these culture shocks sound familiar, share this with someone who has ever returned from America and suddenly found home strangely small. Like the video, follow along, and subscribe for more stories about the bizarre moments when European expectations collide with American reality. Of course, none of this should be treated as an official scientific measurement of Europe or America. These stories come from travelers, immigrants, and individuals describing their own experiences, frustrations, preferences, and culture shocks. One person's terrible airport experience does not define an entire country. Just as one person's incredible experience in Texas does not mean every European will suddenly want to move there. The comparisons in this story are deliberately dramatic because the emotional reactions themselves are the point. Europe is not one single place. America is not one single experience. And millions of people on both sides of the Atlantic would strongly disagree with some of these observations. Personal experiences can be powerful, but they are still personal experiences. So verify the claims for yourself. Visit the places, talk to the people, try the food, walk through the streets, experience the customer service, stand inside Costco, order the enormous drink, and then decide whether America really produces the strange condition we've been calling post-American depression, or whether Europeans simply discover that their ancestors left a few things out of the story. Because after all, would you ever sign the Declaration of Independence if you knew your ancestors were watching? Would you trade a centuries-old European identity for Texas brisket, Southern hospitality, giant supermarkets, free refills, and a stranger casually telling you that your shirt looks great? Could you live in America after growing up surrounded by European traditions? Or would you return home, walk into that narrow supermarket, look at the tiny drink, and suddenly whisper, "Where's the rest of it?" Maybe America isn't actually better. Maybe Europe isn't actually worse. Maybe the real culture shock is discovering that the place you were taught to admire isn't necessarily the place where you personally feel most alive. And perhaps that is the question worth answering for yourself.